emphasis on architecture. In my introduction of Ken, I learned that he's not a native of Portland, but hails from Cleveland, Ohio. However, he's been in Portland for 18 years, so I think we can officially consider him an official Portland resident now. He went to high school in Cleveland, graduated from North Carolina State in Raleigh, 4 years of architecture, and then went on and spent 2 years at MIT, from which he took an advanced degree in architecture. He's been working in that field since 1977. Has worked and studied in San Francisco, Vienna, Cleveland, Australia, Philadelphia, so I think we can say that Ken has been around. He worked in Portland for a couple of years, about 2.5 years before starting his own architectural firm 16 years ago. And his experience with the classical Chinese garden dates clear back to 1990. He was a member of the Classical Chinese Garden Society, and he was with the first group of trainees that went through to become a docent or guide at the Portland Garden. So he's been doing that since we opened. Today we'd like to welcome his wife, Amy, and his son, Jesse. They're joining us for today's meeting. Now, I'd like to let it go at that and introduce Ken Diener with a first Saturday welcome, and his talk today is going to be A Mountain Out of Your Doorway.
Thank you. Thanks, Jan. And hello, everybody. Let me get a couple of clicks going here. And I think everything is ready, so that looks good. I'm beginning. All right. So welcome. As you guys have seen in Katie's emails and the little teaser that Dennis and I wrote, and in the title, Mountain Out Your Doorway, or Mountain Out Your Doorway. I chose it because it sort of represents the experience of moving through an architectural element. So the exhilaration we all feel, or most of us, I'll speak out for all of us, as you walk into the garden, the immediacy of the garden. It talks about the experience that you sort of feel as you come through a doorway and that something opens up to you. And it also talks about status. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is status and how things relate to status, which is sort of an interesting thing. But as I came to thinking about this, this topic, status kept coming up. For those of you who are tuned in to Chinese Feng Shui, the title automatically starts talking about, you know, did he choose something really inauspicious for his title? And I was like, well, I want to make sure that I'm not really off the wrong track here. So, like all good things, yin and yang, and I apologize for my pronunciations. I always do yin yang, yin yang, and you'll see it as I go through. It turns out there is auspicious and inauspicious things when it comes to mountains out your doorway. You start with inauspicious. When you have mountains directly in front of your front door, it indicates that every plan you make will fail and will be complete lack of success in everything you do. So I was like, well, this may not be the right title. But however, when the mountain is in front of your home, are further away than a li, I think it's called, which comes out to be li, or a kilometer or a half mile away, then it turns into auspicious. So, so I guess we're still okay. And then the front door, in the inauspicious side, the front door should not open onto a wall of mountains. And of course, as you get that, the nearer the mountain, the worse it is. And you know, with the Feng Shui things, it's superstitious, it's interesting, but what I found is, just like if you're familiar with the pattern language from Christopher Alexander from the University of Oregon, the Feng Shui things, they may seem superstitious, but when you think about it, they have real practical application. Obviously, if there's a mountain less than a half a mile away in front of your door, mountain slides, avalanches, flooding, and it makes a lot of sense. And almost everything you do Feng Shui makes a lot of sense in real practical terms. So it's definitely valid. So but when there are 6 distinct summits, your family will always have support of the leader and powerful people. When there are 5 peaks visible, and this is where you start playing with it, your family will suffer ill health. But if you put a mountain, like in a picture, or a rock behind you, that will add a 6th peak. And you'll be okay. When there are 9 distinct peaks visible, your family will always have wealth, prosperity, and a good fortune through your generations.
Could you talk a little slower and louder?
Okay, thank you. All right, so when there's 9 distinct peaks, your family will have good fortune and will stretch through 9 generations. And we think about our brothers to the southeast of us right now, and there's Bend, Oregon. And if I do a lot of work in Bend, Oregon, and one of my best clients has an amazing view on Aubrey Butte facing these mountains, as you know from Bend. And if you count the mountains in Bend, you can get 9 peaks. So they may have a little bit of trouble right now, but I think they're all right, and I think for 9 generations they'll be all right. So the 6th peak is a little subtle. So maybe that's why they're having trouble. But then when there's one single peak visible at the back of your home, this represents the sign of the turtle. It's extremely auspicious. A family will enjoy exceptional good protection, and one is also the number of great success in a career. So of course, when you're up on the West Hills, we got the turtle and the one peak, and we're in good shape. So, for most of you who have seen my tours, and for those poor greeters that have heard the beginning of my tour over and over and over again, Dale, I don't think is here. But Dale was the greeter when I started tours for about 5 straight years. And after he heard the beginning of my tour, it's like 3 times a week for 5 years, and he knew how I was going to get started. I'd always see Dale like move around the corners, like I don't think he can hear it again. Anyway, those of you who know that I start my tour, I always have a big book bag of stuff, and I have my favorite scroll painting with me at all times. And every time I open this scroll, there's just some wonder that I have with it. It's almost similar to walking into our garden. And as you know, and I talk about, the garden, our garden sort of talks about an ideal life. This painting for me is sort of like the ideal, perfect space. There's mountains in the distance. It's auspicious. It removes you from your fixed existence in the city. There's a daily forest walk. We talk about waterfalls and forest paths. There's pavilions in the water and bridges creating space. And there's just something that's just absolutely fantastic about this painting. And again, you can see it's from the 10th century. But coincidentally, and we can sort of think about this in over time, you talk about America's greatest house. And you guys probably can guess that. I'll give you a little preview. And this is a slide I took 30 years ago. I've been to this house 3 times, and this is a slide I took 30 years ago. And I bought a slide scanner just recently, and I was scanning in these slides. I hadn't seen this slide probably in 20 years. And I was looking at this picture that I took, and I was like, this fantastic slide of falling water. And it's like, okay, well, there's mountains in the distance, and there is a daily forest walk, and waterfalls and so forth. Just as a quick history note, the client thought Frank would build the house down here, looking at the waterfall, and completely surprised him by putting the house up here. But you get the auspicious removal from the city existence and the forest paths. And so you take my favorite painting, my favorite spot, and it's incredibly similar. It's really scary. And I did this quickie thing. You got the mountain. You've got the waterfall in the distance, waterfall in the distance. You have an upper lake, sort of hidden there, tucked into the trees. The first sort of auspicious little lake up there. The secondary waterfall. The pond in the foreground. There's even little rocks that are acting as bridges down here. You got the bridges over the river right here. And the water auspiciously flows in a narrow way off the painting.
I bet you on the right, there are no swimming pool in the basement.
Yeah, well, there's a swimming pool. There is.
No, on your right.
Oh.
was just going to say, one of the extraordinary things about falling water, as you were talking about Chinese gardens, is, and it was clearly intentional on Wright's part, in each room, the sound of the water is different. It is positively spooky how it, so that as you move into each room, you have an entirely different experience, and every room hears the water.
Yep.
It's quite simple.
Yep. Yeah, and it's really making it similarly in the garden. You know, you hear the waterfall in our garden, right? And that was one of the things that Wright talked about, was that you don't have the waterfall in your face. By being here, you have to walk out to this porch to see the waterfall. And as you're saying, the sound of the water is there always, but you have to walk to it. So again, just sort of an interesting. Just expanding a little bit on Jan's intro for me. Since I'm talking about architecture for me always is, it's a very personal thing, and I think it is for most people. Now, I've known a lot of you for 18 years, or some of you for full 18 years, but this is the first chance I've had to really stand up in front of you and talk to you, which is sort of interesting. When Dennis volunteered me 5 months ago, it's sort of like it's like, okay, well, this is going to be good, but I was like, okay, how do I do this? Because typically, I think of myself as a generalist, not a true scholar. We've done most of these first Saturdays and listened to really scholarly folks who have specialized in amazing, specific Chinese things. And I know I have my own practice. I build retail a lot of the time. And so this was a chance for me to sort of hone this presentation and talk about specific things. So we got, again, the intro. So Jessie, Amy, and Claire. Claire's not here. She has terrible bronchitis and a terrible cough. And a couple images of our house. And, in a true teenage fashion, we had a discussion with Jess about coming today, and it represented, it sort of brought up a really interesting life lesson as I sort of thought about, possibly getting a chance to watch my dad give a lecture, which my dad was holed up in a factory for 40 years, and he gave a lecture once when I was about 9 or 10 to the Spectroscopy Society, something really interesting, right? But, it's like, I never, and of course I couldn't go, I was about 9 or 10, and I never saw my dad's factory. And those of you who have grown up in a winter climate, Cleveland, I forget exactly what month, but we had about 18 inches of snow. I was about 9 or 10 years old, and this is a true life lesson in preparedness. My dad didn't speak very often as a public speaker.
Or at all.
And a true factory engineer. And he was speaking in front of the Spectroscopy Society, and he had and this is 1968 or 69, he had his entire presentation on note cards. And I remember him being pretty nervous about preparing for it, and I remember him going out to the car, and then about an hour later, I get a call. I'm about 9 or 10 years old, and my dad is just nervous as heck. He says, go out onto the driveway. When I was so nervous about leaving, I put my speech on the roof of my car, and I drove off. And he goes, go out to the driveway, and there was 18 inches of snow in the driveway and on the road, and he said, see if my note cards are there. And I'm pulling his speech that he had worked for months on out of the ruts of the snow. And it's like, I think I salvaged most of it, but he was like, it's too late. This is gone or so. I said, so what'd you do? And he said, I had to rewrite the whole thing just before I got up there. So, when I was heading out here today, it was like, okay, technology, do I have everything? No, nothing on the roof of my car. So anyway, this is sort of a life lesson. Just as a little background, some of you know, Jess, it's okay. I do a lot of disc golfing. So here's Pier Park, one of the most beautiful spaces in Portland. And I go out at like 6:30 or 7 in the morning. That's the third hole in the basket. This is the first hole in Cleveland and in Lake Erie. And as the really cringer of the family, I do a lot of internet sailing. So there's an image of internet sailing for you. But anyway, as Jim mentioned, I've lived in Cleveland, Raleigh, North Carolina, San Francisco, Berkeley, Palo Alto, lived and worked in Vienna, school in Boston, lived and worked and taught in Perth, Australia. We lived in Philly, and then after 6 months of Philly, my wife and I said we're out of this East Coast stuff and came to Portland 18 years ago. So why have I given you so much background on this? As an architectural philosophy, architecture is a sum of our own very unique personal background. And as I've taught school, I've taught design school and images, and I've thought a lot about my design work over the last 30 years. And architecture I sort of feel architecture is a collective, a collective image of our own personal experiences of home and school. And if you sort of think about what you value as architecture for yourself, think about your own home, your own schools that you have experience in, and they'll start giving you answers about what you really value in architecture. So there's a picture of my family's house. My parents still live there. And you see this weird little calculation I threw up here. 480 divided by 20. When I'm on my tours, I talk about the I.M. Pei family having a garden in Suzhou for over 600 years and investing in rocks for 70 years before they ever get placed in the garden. And I asked my tour, how many of you are living in a house that previous generations of your own family have lived in? And I've been asking for that about a year, and so I'm guessing I've probably talked to about 480 folks over the course of the year. I've gotten 20 yeses. That's only 4.1% of people that, Americans typically, that you ask that question are living in a family home of previous generations. So it's pretty amazing. We accept it as our normal life, but it's a pretty interesting statistic. I grew up in Cleveland and Shaker Heights. That's my elementary school. This is my wife's elementary school. That's my dad's elementary school. My mom's elementary school.
My mom's too.
She went to Loma too?
She did.
I missed that one. Sorry, mother-in-law. My father and I went to junior high school here. This is my grandmother's high school. This is my wife's middle school. That's the new high school up the hill.
The better one.
And then my mother-in-law, my father, my mother, and I went to high school at this building. And it talks about continuity, but I find that, in my theory, this sort of breaks down because these, despite their nice buildings, they don't quite have too much involved in what I do design-wise. But what was really freaky was I went back to Cleveland for my mom's heart valve surgery back in 2005. I'm looking out her, I guess it was the intensive care window of the hospital, and I look out, and there's this building I went to preschool in. And I was like, God, this is really weird. I mean, I have lots of memories of this building. And I remember walking up to these stairs, and there's a Keystone 1960. And look at these pathways right here. And think about that in the next couple of slides. I remember walking in this door as a 4-year-old. You start looking at this, and when I'm doing architecture, I do these little roof moves all the time. I usually have gables. I usually do infill and piers, a neat little entry tucked into the piers, a great little entrance and a sort of writing planter there. It was like, I started walking around this thing. It's like, God, this is weird, and I hadn't seen it in like 25 years. And I remember going to this. This was a preschool that I went to on weekends, and it was run by Dr. Spock. I was part of a Dr. Spock study, and we went there on Saturdays, and I remember this incredibly huge playground. What was really cool was they had a slide back then, 40 plus years ago, that you'd climb up on the roof of this garage and you'd slide down from that garage. Playful architecture in a cool little backyard space. And what's really wild is there's a swing right there. Imagine little Kenny Diener getting pushed by Dr. Spock on that swing right there. And it was still there. And it's not long for this world. You can see the hospital's grown up around it. And I've talked to the architects about it, and I've gotten drawings of it.
You didn't mention that your house your great-grandfather built.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You didn't mention any of that.
Oh, sorry. That house that you saw there, that was built by my great-grandfather, or for my great-grandfather. They were in it from 1927 up until the 1950s. George Zell, Cleveland Orchestra, bought it from my great-grandfather. He was in the house for 15 plus years, and then when he died, my parents bought it back from Mrs. Zell in 1970, and then they've been in the house. Since then, we've had 5 generations in that house. So that sort of speaks of different generations. But anyway, this is just sort of a weird thing, and it's the kind of thing I'm talking about. When you go back in your history, you find these connections that are just spooky. So other design influences, I went to NC State. You can see already that I love Wright. My nickname in school was Frankie. Green, Maybach, Japanese architecture class, aesthetics class. And then Aim and I, when we went off to Perth, Australia, we spent a week in Sydney. And the most incredible space in Sydney, Australia was the Sydney's Chinese Friendship Garden in Darling Harbour. And you know, here we spent a week in Sydney, and the best spot in the entire week was playing around in these waterfalls and these rocks, looking up at these buildings. This was 1988, actually, 1988. And I don't know if it's still the case, but one of the things I really valued about the Aussie is they're a little bit looser. Insurance wasn't such a big deal, and you could sit on those rocks anywhere you wanted on those waterfalls. It was one of the greatest spots in Sydney, and looking up at the high rises from the waterfalls in that garden. So when I came to Cleveland in the Artquake in 1990, there was this, you know, this little booth that the Classical Chinese Garden Society had up, and I joined up at that point. But you know, why does architecture intrigue us? It's more than just a creation shelter. It creates an image and a context that we all call home. There's an aspect that ideally and hopefully you bring some beauty into people's lives. And again, it comes back to status. It's sort of a good piece of architecture, sort of can create wonders. It talks about views, and it gives you a sense of tangible wealth. And we'll talk about that some more. But when you get in architecture school and you start thinking about putting architecture together, one of my best professors came up with this diagram, and it's a really, really valuable diagram. I've kept it with me for basically my whole life. 4 quadrants: structure, symbol, formal, and experiential.